Today is Wednesday, October 27th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. In this talk, I intend to speak to homeschooling mothers, and I want to be very clear about that, because the work of caring and teaching young children is almost always the work of homeschooling mothers. Even if children are sent to school, they learn their first lessons at home from their mothers. And even when they go to school, successful students are those who work at home studying with the help of their mothers. But for homeschooling families, the work of teaching young children is handled by homeschooling mothers. And in this talk, I'm going to address some very practical issues that relate to teaching young children. The question that I'd like to meditate on in this talk is, how should young children be managed by homeschooling mothers? How should young children be managed and taught by homeschooling mothers? What I'm going to share with you in this talk is not going to be found in many homeschool publications. It's not going to be taught at many homeschool conferences. It's not going to be explained in the homeschool catalogs. It's not going to be written about by the homeschool gurus publishing books. It's not spoken about or written about because if homeschooling mothers would learn to do these things, the homeschool industry that sells boxes and boxes and boxes of books to homeschool mothers would lose all of its opportunity to make money, because the homeschool market exploits the anxieties and inexperience of homeschooling mothers and capitalizes on the mother's uncertainty about what to do with their children. The homeschool community encourages mothers to pull their kids out of school, and then the conversation immediately shifts to what products you're going to need to buy. And homeschool mothers don't start where they should start as they begin homeschooling. They start with catalogs, making book purchases. And in most homeschools, they have to either submit to some curriculum publisher and do what their books tell them to do, or they have a chaotic mess in the house with kids doing whatever they want. But what they don't do is start with goals for their homeschool and then work to carry out those academic goals. We're talking about homeschooling. We're talking about providing an entire education for one or more children. And contrary to what homeschool promoters say, it's not something fun and awesome. It's something that's very difficult. I think I've seen 6 different families in 13 years running the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I've seen 6 different families break up through divorce because of the stress of homeschooling. Homeschooling is not easy. Homeschooling is not fun. Homeschooling is heroic, noble work, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult if you actually pursue true Christian goals in education and don't just settle for the dum-dum box curriculum with the workbooks and minimum modern school requirements. If you want to pursue true Christian goals in education, if you want to give your children an education that in any way resembles the education of the saints, you have a very challenging mission in front of you. You need to respect the difficulty of that mission. You need to respect the needs of your children for you not to merely choose to homeschool them, but to do so skillfully and effectively over a long period of time. Possibly 13 or more years, if we consider formal schooling years. You've got a very hard task ahead of you, and not only is it hard enough by itself, if you had just one child and had no more children after that one child and had 18 years to manage the education of that one child, you could exhaust yourself in that work because it never ends. There's so much that needs to be done, so many important lessons that need to be learned. It's exhausting missionary labor. It's not social activities or playtime. It's a heroic undertaking. And the reality is that most of us don't have the opportunity to teach one child, but we get one child started and mom is pregnant with a second. And she's got to manage the education of one while she carries around the second. And she goes through labor and delivery and then into nursing. And she's got to continue to manage the older child while she nurses the younger child. And then some time goes by and mom learns that she's expecting a third child. And this complexity of family life is normal in homeschooling. And so even though the task of raising one child would be exhausting in itself, the task grows more and more complicated as time goes on. And outside of all of this childbearing, there are all the other trials and challenges of life that need to be dealt with. And homeschooling is conducted in the midst of all that, primarily by the mother. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the father's ability to provide so that the mother can devote her entire life and attention to the children is one of the greatest contributions a father can make to his family. I'm not going to get into that in this talk, though I'm tempted to, because I want to keep this as a practical talk about how to manage the education and how to teach young children in a homeschool setting. And like I said, this is not popular talk among homeschool circles, because I don't know if you've noticed, but in homeschool circles, everyone seems to be trying to make money. And there's rarely any honest or proven advice given in homeschool circles, because most of the advice is given to lead to a purchase. But if we were to ask, how should we teach our children based on human nature, based on the goals of a true Christian education, based on the complexity of real-world homeschool life, we would get answers that are very different from what the homeschool market is selling to homeschool families. And I'd like to talk about the practical details, of how homeschooling mothers need to manage the education of their young children and teach them. And I'm emphasizing young children because the goal of homeschooling for a homeschooling mother is to lead her young children to become independent students by the time they're entering into their teens. The goal for a homeschooling mother is not to play mommy with her young adult children. The goal of a homeschooling mother is not to set her up in an unsustainable position as a teacher of all subjects in the home, because she will not be able to fulfill that role. She's to understand the role that she plays. She's to understand the need the family has and will have for help in the education of the children. And most importantly, she's to understand the role the child himself or herself needs to play in his or her own education. And all of these things direct the homeschooling mother to understand her true role and how she should manage the education of her young children, how she should teach her young children. And if these methods that I'm going to discuss are practiced by a homeschooling mother, she will not be dependent on any homeschool curriculum. She will be able to pursue any goals that she seeks. She will be able to use materials that other homeschool families cannot use because they simply don't have the discipline to use them. And she will produce the most successful results in the lives of her children. And as I said, these practices are not promoted in homeschool circles because everyone's trying to make the homeschool families dependent on the publishers and dependent on the conferences and on the books and the gurus, rather than helping them to become independent and actually succeed. Most of the problems of homeschooling will be eliminated if these practices are established and maintained. So let's talk about the practical details of how a homeschooling mother should manage the education of her young children and teach them day by day. The first problem we have to overcome is that almost every homeschooling mother listening to this talk grew up and experienced a modern education, and in her educational experience has experience with false and unproductive methods of teaching. And so a homeschooling mother cannot simply reach back into her own childhood experience and reproduce the activities that she did when she was in school. The work of a homeschooling mother requires very different activities, very different methods, or it will not be sustainable. You can get on Instagram, you can set up your cute little homeschool room with all of your cubbies and cabinets and decorations, your planner on your desk with your coffee cup. You can set up these beautiful photos for Instagram. On the first day of school, you can videotape and publish your exciting unpackaging of your box of school books. All of that social media activity is easy. You can dress the kids all up for their first day of school. You can clean and paint the schoolroom, get all new supplies, and make everything look picture perfect for an Instagram post. But you're not going to get results. And as I always say, we never see pictures of the homeschool in November or February or May, always in September. And what I'd like is to help you so that you can, if you are going to post pictures or show off your homeschool life, you can do it at the end of the year when the results have been produced. And you're not simply showing off stuff you bought, but you can share the results of things that you did. Now, again, we're talking about young children. And when I say young children, I'm talking about children from the ages of toddlers up through age 12. As I said, the goal as a homeschool parent is to train your child to become an independent student by the time he reaches his teenage years. And by teenage years, I mean 13, not 19, 13. If you want to talk about saints, spend some time learning about the lives of the saints, and you'll learn that a saint like Saint Dominic went to the university at this age. 12, 13, 14. That was the age when many saints began their studies away from home as university students. Alexander the Great was leading his father's army when he was 16 years old. This modern idea that children should be babied into their mid-20s is one of the first evils that we have to purge from our families. The goal of homeschooling with young children is to lead them to become independent students by the time that they enter their teens. And that requires methods of teaching and management to be used that will actually help them to do that. If mommy chooses to set herself up as the teacher and makes everything her children do every day depend on her, she is not going to raise independent students, and she is not going to be able to sustain the work of that homeschool. And it's going to crash and burn, and she can make 1,000 excuses, but I'm telling you up front that those excuses are not valid because the method was false. And I'm going to tell you what you need to do positively and practically to avoid walking down the same path that so many unsuccessful homeschool mothers have walked down before you and are continuing to walk down around you. First of all, we're teaching young children. Philosophy and Catholic teaching tell us that these children that we're teaching are creatures composed of body and soul, made in the image and likeness of God. We're teaching very special creatures who are composed of body and soul, and they are made in the image of God. That affects how we're to think about these children. That affects how we're to deal with these children. That affects what our goals are for these children, because these children were not made in the image of God to just do whatever their parents decide they should do, or to do whatever they decide they should do for themselves. These children were made by God, and they were made for God. They were made not only as a race in general, but as individuals to serve the will of God in their own individual life. And you, as their parent, have no idea what the details of that will is. That will unfold in their lives as they grow up. Their abilities and interests will direct them in discerning that goal. And if you or they choose to reject that will in their lives and do something else, do something of your own will, that child will never fulfill his or her purpose in God's will and will never be happy or settled. And therefore, these children are not your baby dolls to play with. You have a very specific and important duty to fulfill in their lives as their parents. And everything that you do has to agree with this reality. Yes, you are the mother. Yes, you bore these children. Yes, you nursed and changed diapers and took care of these children. That's all true. But you're doing that service for God's sake. And you're raising that child not to become your servant, but to become God's servant. And that's an important realization. And if you listen to homeschooling mothers talk about their children and talk about their homeschooling, you'll often find that what they say does not agree with this reality. So that's the first thing. And there needs to be some healthy detachment from the children so that you can fulfill this important role in their lives. It's funny because in modern society we actually have a phrase called attachment parenting. But the truth is, in order for parents to fulfill their role as parents, there needs to be some detachment from the children so that the parents can think of things and act objectively and fulfill God's will in the raising and education of these children. That's a very complicated topic and subject, and we're not going to get into all of that, but we're going to focus on the details and practical implications of that as regards their education. So there needs to be some healthy detachment. The child is not yours. The child is not born for your service, for your pleasure, to do your will, and you need to accept that. And a good model to look at in this duty is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Remember when she brought the child Jesus into the temple after his birth, Simeon stopped her and spoke to her about the child and told her, "A sword shall pierce your heart." And we know the images of the Blessed Virgin Mary at the foot of the cross in agony as she watches her son suffer horribly according to the will of God. We see throughout his life these moments, these tense moments. For example, when he's lost, when they visit the temple, when he's 12 years old, and Jesus is lost, and they don't know where Jesus is, and they find him in the temple. And Mary says to Jesus, naturally speaking, "We looked everywhere for you, and we couldn't find you." And Jesus responds to her and says, "Didn't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" And we see there that detachment. Later in Jesus' life, Jesus is in the midst of his public ministry. His mother and family members are outside the house where he happens to be. And one of his disciples says, "Lord, your mother and brothers are outside." And Jesus says to them, "Who are my mother and brothers? Whoever does the will of my Father, he is my mother and my brother." And again, we see in the life of Jesus this detachment between the mother and the son. And that's not because there is or was any conflict between Jesus and his mother. Jesus lived the life that he did to give us an example, to serve as a model. And he taught us the importance of this detachment, because not all Christian boys and girls or men and women are going to enjoy the privileges that he had in having Joseph and Mary as his parents. Children, when they reach adulthood, and even throughout childhood, are not obliged to do the will of their parents outside or in contradiction to the will of God. And parents have no right to demand of their children or to direct their children in anything but the will of God. And this requires in parents, especially in mothers, a holy detachment. The emotions can't be allowed to just run loose and direct all of the affairs of family life. Everything that a mother feels is true, but her feelings have to be subjected to the truth of the situation, which is that this child belongs to God. And she is fulfilling a role in the service of God, raising this child to become one of God's servants, to serve God in some way that she herself does not necessarily know. God doesn't reveal it to parents. And she needs to learn to stay in her lane, as it were. The Blessed Virgin Mary provides the perfect model and example of this detachment. How many times do we see the Blessed Virgin Mary standing to the side, watching the events unfold in her son's life, and the scripture tells us, and Mary pondered all these things in her heart. That's a holy mother. Not just doing her own will, none of this foolish emotional talk that we often hear from mothers. The Virgin Mary is the model of a Christian mother. And I recommend that you read the Gospels as a mother with this as your focus. Reading through the Gospels, focusing on the Virgin Mary, paying attention to her relationship with Jesus and with those around Jesus. And you'll find many rich meditations by reading with that focus. So having said that, let's get on to some practical implications of these things. Your child is created body and soul in the image of God to live for God and never find satisfaction until he rests in the will of God. He's a creature of body and soul, and the church teaches us that this likeness, or what it means to be made in the image of God, means that a person, your child, is given a soul that will never die, and that this soul possesses understanding and free will. This child is given a soul. This child is made in the image of God. This child has a soul endowed with understanding and free will. The church also teaches us that when we say that the soul is endowed with understanding, what that primarily means is that the human soul is endowed with the faculty of reason. Man is a rational animal. The child that you're to instruct is a rational animal. An animal composed of both body and soul, endowed with understanding and free will, intended to discern and do the will of God in his life. The church also teaches us that this faculty of reason, like the bones and muscles of the body, develops over time. The faculty of reason is the capacity to reason. But this reasoning ability that's given to a child develops over time. The child, as you know, will not receive first reconciliation or first Holy Communion until he reaches a certain age. And this age is a moment of development as a human being. And we call this the age of reason. The age of reason, or some call it the age of accountability. It's when a child is said to know right and wrong. And this is something that develops in a child. And think about it. We delay first sacraments, not baptism, of course, but we delay confession and communion until this development is believed to reach a certain point. And that point is not when the child says his first words. That point is not when the child finally learns to use the potty. That point is not when the child learns to walk or when the child learns to read. That point is when the child begins to reason. And this is a key point in the child's life and a key point in a child's education. And how many homeschool mothers do you hear talking about the importance of coming to the age of reason in homeschooling? It's very rarely spoken about, and all of the stuff that parents are doing rarely takes into consideration the reality of this development. Now think about it. You'll have a 3-year-old child, 4-year-old child, and you'll say, oh man, we've got to get going, get this kid started with school. What are you going to do with a child that hasn't reached the age of reason? What are you going to do with that child's education? You're going to start reasoning with the child? You'll hear people say things like this. They'll say, well, you should never punish a child. You should never spank a child. You should never you should reason with your children. That makes sense, right? No, of course that makes no sense. You can't reason with a 3-year-old. The age of reason develops years later, 7, 8 years old. And that's the age of reason is a general stage of development. Not some artificial stage of development concocted by philosophers in modern schools and universities. This is a real stage of human development taught by the authority of the church. You can't reason with a toddler, and the education of a child before the age of reason should be of a certain character. Now, this may offend some people, but this is why things through history were done the way that they were done when Catholics and wise men were in charge of things. If we want to know how a child should be managed before the age of reason, the answer is like an irrational animal. Before the age of reason, a child should be managed like an irrational animal. You likely have in the house some dogs, some cats, maybe some farm animals, and you don't reason with the dogs and the cats. You don't try to have academic discussions with the family cow. You understand that this is an irrational animal. This is an animal that acts according to its natural impulses and desires. An animal can have memory. Animals can remember things. That's why they can be trained. You can teach the dog, every time I whistle, I want you to come and sit down by my feet. And the dog will do it for a treat. And dogs can be trained to do incredible things. Take a few minutes, go on YouTube and look up Australian sheepdogs or English sheepdogs and watch how they're trained. Watch the work that they do, how they herd entire herds of sheep by the sounds of whistles from the shepherd. Watch the training of police dogs and how they're taught to apprehend criminals. And you can see that animals can be taught amazing things even though they do not have reason. The fact that they're irrational does not mean that they can't be taught. And in fact, we refer to many animals as being smart. And what we mean by smart is primarily that they have good instincts and they have memory. And therefore we can train them to do good things. And when we're dealing with young children, we have to understand that before the age of reason, and even through the early years when they've reached the age of reason, we're primarily to deal with them like animals. We're to motivate them with rewards. We're to prevent them from doing bad things by punishments. They desire comfort. They desire food. They desire pleasures. They do not want any pain or discomfort or deprivation. And this is how young children are managed. They're not reasoned with. We don't write up a constitution and ask a toddler to sign the constitution. We manage our children before the age of reason as irrational animals. And there's nothing bad about being called an irrational animal. I didn't say actually the child is an irrational animal. I said the child at this stage of development is to be managed like an irrational animal. This is taught all through the book of Proverbs. It's why we say things like, spare the rod, spoil the child. Now, what the rod means in some fundamentalist circles means literally spanking the child, but it's much more complex than that. It simply means that if we don't employ the practical wisdom that we need to employ to handle children, if we shrink back from discouraging bad behavior with punishments, we will spoil the child. And those punishments can just be a million different things. And they also include positive rewards, motivating good behavior. So I'd like you to think about that. And again, we can understand how to train dogs to do all kinds of things, and then we watch as mothers try to handle children that are completely wild and out of control. If they were allowed to bring their dogs to church, the dog would probably sit by their feet silent the whole time, but the child climbs all over the pew and is pulling the mother's hair out, screaming. And we're saying, oh, ho, ho, look at the little baby. No, that's not normal. That's not normal. We know how to train a dog, but we pretend that we can't train a child. And that's simply false. We have to be prudent and shrewd in training our young children, helping them until reason begins to develop in them and comes to our assistance and allows us to use other methods to continue their training. So that's simple enough. But again, you'll notice that it's never talked about in homeschool circles. In fact, homeschool families will actually boast that it's perfectly okay to have wild, crazy children as they spank the dog for going to the bathroom in the house. It's just not rational behavior. Now, to move on to more about teaching. When we think about the academic activity of such children, when we look back to the quote-unquote old days, we'll find that children were handled in a way very differently than they're handled today. If you look at any ancient painting or sculpture of the liberal arts, you'll see grammar holding a switch or a stick, meaning that the education of young children requires discipline because they're not rational. They can't be reasoned with. They have to be disciplined. This is, again, where I said the detachment of parenting becomes very important. Discipline is not pleasant, but Scripture says that the son whom a father loves, he chastens. Chastening and disciplining children is tiresome and difficult. It's an act of sacrifice. And parents have to labor because this work is demanding. And again, don't turn this into some silly talk about spanking kids. I've said multiple times that it includes all kinds and forms of positive and negative motivations. It has a lot to do with the family schedule. It has a lot to do with the order established in the home by the mother. It's a complicated topic, and I'm not going to talk about that in this talk because I want to get to some practical academic activities and methods. But that work of discipline, structuring the school, organizing the schedule, developing the culture in the home, so that everything in the child's life moves them in good behavior and blocks them from bad behavior. That's the whole point of household management. That's the duty of parents. Train up a child in the way he should go. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Whom a father loves, he chastens. These are the principles of parenting. Now, when it comes to academic work, we have to think about how this nature of our children should direct what they do in their schooling. And as I said, in the old days, it was understood that the schoolmaster, the grammar schoolmaster, was a disciplinarian. And before you talk about, back in the old 1800s, the kids knew so much more. Remember, the kids were whipped in schools. So be careful that you don't start praising the achievements of the old schools without considering the means by which those achievements were produced. Those kids back in the old days, in old Christian societies where they knew the nature of man, they knew what it meant to be inclined to evil and under the influence of original sin, and they used a stick and many other forms of punishment to make those kids do what they were commanded. So be careful when you boast about the achievements of the old schools that you also consider the means by which those achievements were brought about. But as for the actual academic activities of the students, they have to be in agreement with the children's development. We can't ask children to carry out exercises or activities that are appropriate when they're older and more reasonable during the years when they're still not yet at the age of reason or just into the age of reason. You know that in the old schools, memorization was considered the golden rule for education. Children were made to memorize and memorize and memorize and recite and recite and recite, chant and chant and chant. And that's what it meant to be in grammar school, to chant and recite and memorize. And the reason why they did that was because that makes sense when you're dealing with children approaching or just into the age of reason. An irrational animal doesn't have reason, but it does have memory. And therefore, memorization is reasonable in the education of young children. And so the first method that as a homeschooling parent you have to make central to your homeschooling work in teaching young children is memorization. Remember, they're not reasoning. They have memory. They have instincts and desires, and they have aversions. And these are the things that you have to deal with as a homeschooling mother. And there's no one better to deal with these things than mom. I tell my wife all the time, you hold everything that these kids desire in your hand. That's your power as a mother. You make the dinner, you decide who gets gravy, you decide who gets a second helping, you decide how much sugar goes in the iced tea, you decide every detail of the things that the children are guided by, things that make sense to them. All of those things are in the daily control of the mother. Mothers do not have to yell at children. That makes no sense. Mothers do not have to reason with young children. That makes no sense. Mothers can manage children by simple rewards and deprivations. Memory work is the primary method for teaching young children. Recite, 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 recite. If the child learns to read, read aloud. Read aloud, read aloud, read aloud. Memory work, recitation, reading aloud. These are measurable tasks that young children can do. Measurable tasks. Are they tedious tasks? Absolutely. But this is the duty of parents. They're tedious tasks. They're exhausting tasks. But they're reasonable tasks. And they're effective tasks. Drilling and drilling and drilling, exercising the memory because it's all the child has at that point. When dad comes home, he can test memory work very easily. The catechism was written for children in question and answer format because the church understood this. Grammar rules were written in question and answer format. Every elementary science was taught by means of memorization. Arithmetic facts, vocabulary in foreign languages, grammar rules, catechism questions, Bible verses, memory, 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 because that makes sense before the age of reason. And, as I said, even as we enter into the age of reason. Memory, memory, memory. This is why music is important in early education. Children can memorize songs and lyrics and poems. But this can't be lazy. This requires work from parents. Recitation, recitation, testing, testing, testing. That's the work of a homeschooling mother with young children. What's also good about this is when children get older and younger children are born and younger children need to be educated, there's no reason why an older child can't lead a younger child in memory work. Technology helps with this. A mother can read memory work into her phone and record it, give the phone to the child, and let the child play it again and again and again, and memorize what's to be learned. Memory work is method number one in the education of young children. Now let's say they begin to grow a little more, they're learning more, and they're able to write. They start to learn to write. Once the child is, let's say, 5 or 6 years old and ready to start writing, in addition to memory work comes copy work. Copy, copy, copy. Copy everything. If there is a grammar lesson to be studied, copy the lesson. Open the book, copy the lesson onto paper. If there is a Bible verse to be memorized, copy, copy, copy. Memory work and copy work. Copy, copy, copy. Copy whole pages. Copy poems, copy Bible verses. Copy rules of the house. Copy catechism questions. Copy Latin translations. Copy, copy, copy. Have a bucket full of pencils and have a box full of notebook paper and have the kids copy, copy, copy. This is reasonable, beneficial activity before and around the age of reason. Copy, copy, copy. Every time something's copied, teach the children how to put a heading on the paper, how to use margins, how to write on lines, to form every letter properly, to space between words, to capitalize sentences, to capitalize proper nouns. All the lessons that are memorized and learned in the elementary grammar, enforce them in the copy work. Every copy exercise is an exercise in memorization. Every copy work exercise is an exercise in neat handwriting. Every copy work exercise is an exercise in obedience to parents and morals. Every copy work exercise is physical discipline to be learned by the children, training them not to work for 10 seconds and have all the problems of the modern attention deficit disorder child who's never made to memorize or copy, and we wonder why the kid's mind is all over the place. He's never given anything to focus on. He's treated like a reasoning adult from the time he's 2 years old, and he's not ready to be a reasoning adult. And making him live like that is torment. Every copywork exercise is a time to teach good handwriting, proper posture in the chair, neat handwriting, not wrinkling papers, not doodling on papers. Everything being neat, the letters being correct, the spelling being correct. If you'd like to challenge a more advanced student, dictation exercises. Dictation exercises where the parent reads and the children copies. Instead of giving all the children their own books, you can be like an old teacher where there was one book in the classroom on the teacher's desk, and when it was time to give the children the lesson, she read it to them and they wrote it down on their own paper. That's dictation. If there are catechism questions and answers to learn, read them out loud and have the children copy them. And then you can check the children's writing. You can check to see that they spelled all the words correctly. You can see that they're writing neatly. You can see that they used capital letters. You can check their punctuation. Everything they learn in elementary grammar can be checked every time they copy something. Copy work, dictation, memory work. These are the three most important methods of teaching homeschooling mothers should use in teaching their young children. Memory work, copy work, and dictation. If you don't practice these methods, what's going to happen is you're going to have kids sitting around idle, staring into space. For example, if you give a child a book and say, go read your book, you have no idea what the child's doing. You have no idea if he's reading. You have no idea if mentally he's paying attention, if he's engaged with what he's reading. You have no idea. There's no way to measure that activity. And this is what most parents have their kids doing, stuff like this. Go work on your lesson. Go study your lesson. Go read your book. Those are all unmeasurable activities, and parents should not do that. If you want a child to go and read a book, you should tell the child to go stand by his desk or next to the table and read the book aloud. And every line that the boy reads, you should be paying attention to whether he's articulating the sentences correctly, whether he's reading with the right expression, whether he's pronouncing the words correctly. If there are pronunciation problems, you need to focus on those things and deal with them. but make him read out loud. Not quiet, not by himself. Make him read out loud. That's measurable. And you can assess his reading and correct his reading. As for pronunciation issues, that's a part of development. Most children don't understand what they sound like. A good solution to that is your smartphone. Give them your smartphone, turn the video camera on, and have them read out loud into the camera so they can watch themselves and hear what they sound like. They'll know that their pronunciation is wrong when they see it in a video. They may not know that. Because here's a little test. If you pronounce a word incorrectly, the way that they do all the time, they'll notice that you said it incorrectly and they'll say, oh, that's not right. But they'll do the same thing themselves, often because they're not even aware that they're doing that. Use your camera. Use an audio recorder. Let them hear it. Let them record it into your camera. Let them make videos. Use measurable activities that are appropriate for their age and development. Not some wacky modern psychological development, not some silly Dorothy Sayers stages of learning. Real human development. The kind that's actually taught by the church. The kind that actually tells you why your children receive communion when they're 7 or 8 years old. Memory work, copy work, dictation, reading aloud. Use technology. Let the kids record themselves. Let them make videos of their activities. Use these tools to teach children who are not yet at the age of reason or who are just developing the powers of their reasoning. Teach the children according to their abilities. That doesn't mean treat them like little babies. That doesn't mean let them play all day long, because they're capable of much more. They're capable of extraordinary things. Plato said youth is the time for extraordinary toil. Youth is the time for extraordinary toil. Don't let the kids play all day. Just because they're not at the age of reasoning, it doesn't make sense to say, oh, well, the children are not yet at the age of reasoning, therefore they should play all day long. That's not a reasonable conclusion. What's reasonable is to say, our children need to be trained to live virtuous lives. Our children do not yet have the assistance of the strength of developed reason, and therefore we need to use other methods to train them in their early habits. Just like we can teach the dog to go outside when he needs to go to the bathroom, just like we can teach the dog not to bark in the house, just like we can teach the dog not to eat off the table, we can also teach the children to have better manners than a dog. Look around. Many children in Christian families are allowed to have worse manners than the family dogs. That's not reasonable. The education of young children requires different methods. Methods that are appropriate for irrational animals. It's very simple to understand. The strength that young children have is their memory. Their memory. What motivates young children is their desire for pleasure and their aversion to pain or deprivation. Padre Pio said, "Beatings and bread make beautiful boys." Beatings and bread make beautiful boys. You can object to that. You can pretend to be offended by that. But those are not my words. Those are the words of Saint Padre Pio. And the book of Proverbs, the sacred scriptures, and every example of every wise Christian grammar school master that ever lived before our crazy modern era taught and practiced the same thing. We have to teach our young children to obey God, to obey their parents, to love their neighbor, to practice good manners, to be clean, to have good hygiene, to live according to the common good. We have to teach our young children all of the principles of Christian morals, but the means by which they're taught before the age of reason are different means than can be employed after the age of reason develops. And realize this: when children grow up to be adults, if they don't live according to reason and choose to live like irrational animals, police officers will handle them like irrational animals. The police officers will not reason with them. The police officers will hold them down on the ground, put them in handcuffs, and put them in prison like a dog in a cage. Police officers will shoot them and kill them like a rabid dog. And the goal of law enforcement, as Aristotle taught it, is to enforce the will of parents on disobedient adult children. So think about that. You have the opportunity to prevent the formation of bad habits. The Proverbs tell us, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's telling you, or I should say, that's warning you, that if you want your child to go in the right way, you have to train him up in that way. You cannot allow bad habits to develop in his life. And you have to nurture and promote the formation of good habits, whether they're voluntary or not. That doesn't matter. As parents, you have complete control over the child's life. You have complete control over the child's clothing, toys, food, time, activity. Everything is in your control as a parent. And you either allow the child to do evil, and that's what it means to spoil the child, or you can use those things and everything else in your power to train your child just as you would the family dog. And I don't say that to compare the child to a dog, but I say that to show that parents are more reasonable in handling their pets than they are their children, because this generation is crazy. They'll train a dog and not a child. So very practically, I'd like to leave you with just those few things to think about. Once you learn to use those things, those methods of teaching, you'll find that you don't need all of these homeschool supplies and resources. You don't need manipulatives and all of this junk that's sold and promoted You don't need any of it. You can teach your children to read with a Bible. You can teach your children to write by simply having them copy verses from the Bible, copying the catechism. You can teach your children with a simple printout of the questions of the Baltimore Catechism. Simple digital copies of texts that are free. You can have the children copy them onto paper. You don't have to buy printed copies of books. A child can look at a digital copy of a book and copy it onto paper one time. And every copy after that can come from the original copy. All of this ridiculous expense and cost of homeschooling can be completely done away with if parents will simply learn how to teach their young children. Now, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, just to wrap up here, these are the kinds of things that direct my decisions. There are things that I know homeschool parents would buy up from me like crazy. I can name them, and they're requested constantly, and maybe parents are confused why I don't do those things which seem to be such obvious money makers. And the reason why is because I'm trying to teach parents how to actually teach their children. Not to just do what everyone else is doing. Yes, everyone would love for me to make videos that 4-year-olds can just sit and watch, but that is not what 4-year-olds should be doing. 4-year-olds should not be watching Sesame Street. 4-year-olds should not just be playing loose in the house. 4-year-olds should be copying letters. They should be learning to write. They should be memorizing the names of letters. They should be made to repeat after mommy. They should be taught to memorize the words of songs. Little children have so much capacity for learning, but the method of instruction is different. The work of parents, especially homeschool mothers during these early years, require that they teach the children according to their present ability and development. Memory work, copy work, dictation, routines, rewards and punishments. That's how you teach young children. You may think it's tedious. I have to copy this again? Yes, copy it again. Copy it for an hour. Remember the old classrooms? They would show a kid writing on the board, "You shall not lie," and he'd have to copy it 100 times on the board. Why? Because that makes sense for a disobedient boy who doesn't live according to reason. It makes sense to make him copy and copy and copy. It makes sense to make him memorize and recite his memory work again and again and again, because what is he going to do instead? What's he going to do instead? Sit at his desk and read his lesson? Go ahead and try that. It's not a measurable activity. It's an activity that does not agree with the child's state of mind and development. Memory work, copy work, dictation, routine, rewards and punishments. This is how you teach a young child at home. God bless.